In May of 1945, Europe was a continent of ghosts. The guns of the Second World War had fallen silent, but the echoes of its horrors remained. Amidst the ruins and the millions of displaced souls, a different kind of war was being waged, a silent hunt for the architects of the catastrophe. How does a man who commanded an empire of death, who held the fate of millions in his hands, simply vanish? This is the story of the final, desperate days of Heinrich Himmler, told from three perspectives: the fugitive running from his past, the soldiers who stood in his path, and the intelligence officers who knew his capture was not just an act of war, but a demand for justice. For Heinrich Himmler, the world had ended not with a bang, but with a betrayal. In the final suffocating days of April, inside the Führer bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler had finally learned of his most loyal disciple's treachery. Himmler, the Reichsführer-SS, the chief of the German police, the man entrusted with the ideological purity and brutal security of the Reich, had been attempting to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies through the Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte. To Hitler, this was the ultimate treason. In his last will and testament, scrawled as Soviet artillery pulverized the city above, Hitler stripped Himmler of all titles and ordered his arrest. Overnight, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany became a man with no power, no master, and no future. He was a dead man, walking, disowned by the very regime he had built. His reaction was not one of defiance, but of bewildered denial. He believed he was the only man capable of restoring order to a shattered Germany. He assembled a small entourage of SS loyalists and fled north towards the city of Lübeck, and then to the so-called Flensburg government, a phantom administration led by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Himmler arrived expecting a seat at the table, perhaps even the leading role in a post-Hitler government. He imagined himself meeting with General Eisenhower, man to man, to negotiate the future of Europe. It was a staggering display of narcissistic delusion. On the 6th of May, Dönitz, wanting nothing to do with the universally despised Reichsführer, formally dismissed him. The man who once commanded legions now commanded nothing. The architect of the Holocaust was officially unemployed. With no purpose and a death sentence from both his former Führer and the victorious Allies, his only remaining objective was survival. The great and terrible Heinrich Himmler had to disappear. For the soldiers of the British Second Army, the end of the war was a landscape of surreal contrasts. The immediate threat of combat was gone, replaced by the monumental task of occupation. Germany was a sea of chaos. Roads were clogged with millions of displaced persons, liberated slave laborers, former concentration camp inmates, and German civilians fleeing the advancing Red Army. Allied command knew that hidden among this tide of humanity were the orchestrators of the war. In response, they initiated Operation Eclipse, a comprehensive plan to disarm the remnants of the Wehrmacht, and most critically, to apprehend the list of wanted Nazi war criminals. This was not a job for specialized commandos, but for ordinary soldiers. Young men from Liverpool, Glasgow, and London found themselves manning countless checkpoints on dusty rural roads. Their orders were simple: check everyone's papers. It was a monotonous, thankless task. They were looking for the faces on the most wanted lists, but the sheer volume of people made it feel like searching for a needle in a continent-sized haystack. At a checkpoint near the village of Bremervörde, a team from the 195th Royal Artillery Air Landing Light Battery went about this routine. They were tired. They had seen the horrors of the newly liberated Bergen-Belsen camp just weeks before. Every forged document, every nervous glance was a potential clue, but after days of checking thousands of papers, a sense of weary repetition had set in. They had no idea that three men walking towards them were about to make their mundane post one of the most significant locations in post-war history. To vanish, Heinrich Himmler decided to become the one thing he had always despised: an anonymous face in the crowd. He shed his SS uniform, the symbol of his immense power, and donned the shabby attire of a discharged sergeant from the Geheime Feldpolizei, the secret field police. The man chosen for this new identity was a real, recently deceased soldier named Heinrich Hitzinger. With the help of his loyal adjutants, Werner Grothmann and Heinz Macher, Himmler began his transformation. He shaved his infamous, neatly trimmed mustache. Most significantly, he covered one eye with a black patch, a simple but brilliant trick to break up the symmetry of his instantly recognizable face. He was no longer the bespectacled, chillingly sterile Reichsführer, but a wounded veteran returning from the front. The papers were the key. They were forgeries, but convincing ones, complete with the necessary stamps. Yet, they contained a subtle but critical flaw. They were too clean, too new. A soldier who had genuinely been through the chaos of the final collapse would have papers that were worn, folded, and dirt-stained. Himmler, the meticulous bureaucrat, had perhaps been too meticulous in creating his disguise. As the trio moved on foot, sleeping in barns and stealing food from abandoned farms, Himmler experienced a life he had only ever observed from a chilling distance. He was now the hunted, reliant on the very anonymity he had spent his career stripping from millions of others. He was traveling through the ruins of the nation he had helped destroy, a ghost haunted by the consequences of his own actions, heading towards what he hoped was safety, but was in reality a final, inescapable reckoning. At the checkpoint in Meinstedt, the first encounter occurred. A British sergeant gave the papers of Sergeant Hitzinger and his two companions a cursory glance. The sheer volume of people needing to be processed meant that only the most obvious discrepancies could be caught. The clean papers, the nervous demeanor, it wasn't enough to raise serious alarm. The guards were looking for high-ranking officers in fine-cut uniforms, not three bedraggled soldiers on foot. They were waved through. For a moment, it seemed the disguise had worked. The architect of genocide had passed through the net, hidden behind the face of a simple sergeant. The trio continued their journey, but their luck was about to run out. 6 hours later, they approached a second checkpoint, this one in Bremervörde. Here the guards were more vigilant. The man in charge was Sergeant Edwin Austin. Austin was a career soldier, a man trained to notice details others missed. When the three men presented their papers, something in his gut told him things were not right. It wasn't just one thing, but a combination of small, unsettling details. The man with the eye patch, Sergeant Hitzinger, had a bearing that was too rigid, too arrogant for a common soldier. His companions were overly deferential. And then there were the papers. Austin looked at the identity document. It was a brand new, crisp paybook. It was pristine. An enlisted man's paybook should have been a dog-eared wreck after years of war. This one looked like it had been printed yesterday. That was the mistake. That was the fatal flaw in the bureaucrat's disguise. Austin made a decision. He would detain them for further questioning. The detention of 3 suspicious soldiers was a routine event. They were taken to a makeshift interrogation center in Bremervörde. The initial questioning was standard procedure, conducted by a duty officer. The man with the eye patch remained calm, insisting he was who his papers said he was. But the inconsistencies were too great. The British officers, now under the command of Captain Tom Sylvester, decided to separate the men and intensify the questioning. Sylvester was a seasoned intelligence officer. He had seen countless prisoners, heard countless lies. He knew the signs of a man hiding a secret far bigger than simple desertion. The 3 men were transferred to the 031 Civil Interrogation Camp, a more secure facility in Lüneburg. Here, the atmosphere changed. The routine processing gave way to a more focused, psychological investigation. The man calling himself Hitzinger was brought before Captain Sylvester. The questions were sharp, probing. Sylvester likely pointed out the flaws in his documents, the inconsistencies in his story. For hours, Himmler held to his cover, but he must have realized the game was up. The net had closed. There was no escape. In a moment that has since become legendary, the prisoner made a request. He asked to speak with the officer in charge. When Captain Sylvester confirmed that he was that officer, the man stood up, removed his eye patch, and placed his spectacles on his nose. The transformation was instant and horrifying. He looked Sylvester in the eye and stated simply and calmly, "I am Heinrich Himmler." The shock in the room must have been electric. The man on their most wanted list, second only to Hitler, was standing before them. The news flew up the chain of command, reaching Colonel Michael Murphy, the head of intelligence in the region. The priority now was twofold: keep him alive and extract every piece of information he possessed. Himmler was the living, breathing archive of the Nazi regime's darkest secrets. The structure of the SS, the mechanics of the concentration camps, the whereabouts of other fleeing Nazis, and the location of stolen wealth. He was, without question, the most important prisoner captured alive. For Himmler, revealing his identity was his final, desperate gambit. As Sergeant Hitzinger, he was a nobody, subject to the whims of low-ranking guards. As Heinrich Himmler, he believed he would be treated with the respect due to a man of his former rank. He expected to be taken to see Field Marshal Montgomery to begin the negotiations he had dreamed of. He still did not comprehend the depth of the world's revulsion for him. He did not see himself as a mass murderer, but as a political leader who had lost a war. But he was a prisoner. He was stripped of his clothes and given a standard-issue British Army uniform, a final humiliation for a man who had lived his life defined by the black uniform of the SS. He was subjected to a body search, a clinical and impersonal procedure that was, in its own way, a form of justice. The man who had ordered the dehumanization of millions was now being treated not as a political figure, but as a specimen, an object of evidence. During the search, the first cyanide capsule was discovered, a standard-issue brass vial sewn into the hem of his clothing. It was confiscated immediately. The British knew the High Command's preference for suicide over capture, but Himmler, ever the cautious planner, had a backup, a second, smaller glass vial, hidden not in his clothes but inside his own body, sealed within a cavity in his jaw. For the moment, it remained his final, dark secret. He was now a prisoner, stripped of his dignity, but he still held the key to his own exit. Colonel Murphy and his team faced a delicate balancing act. Their prisoner was both a source of invaluable intelligence and a profound suicide risk. Every interaction was calculated. They needed to keep him alive, but they also needed to break through his wall of self-importance to get to the truth. The interrogation began not with accusations, but with procedural questions. Murphy's strategy was to treat Himmler as a bureaucrat, to engage him on the level of facts, figures, and logistics. It was a language Himmler understood. They questioned him about the chain of command, the location of SS units, and the vast economic empire he had controlled. Himmler, in his arrogance, began to talk. He believed he was demonstrating his importance, proving his worth as a negotiator. He seemed oblivious to the fact that every word he spoke was simply another nail in his coffin, another piece of evidence for the war crimes tribunal he would inevitably face. He spoke of the Jewish question as a logistical problem he had solved, a task he had completed with organizational efficiency. There was no remorse, no flicker of emotion. It was the chilling, detached confession of a man who had industrialized murder and saw it as just another administrative achievement. As a matter of standard procedure for high-value prisoners, a full medical examination was ordered. Captain Sylvester wanted to be certain there were no hidden injuries and, more importantly, no more hidden poisons. The task fell to Dr. C.J. Wells, a medical officer attached to the unit. Just before 11:30 at night on May 23rd, Dr. Wells entered the small, sparsely furnished room where Himmler was being held. The room was tense, guarded by several soldiers. Himmler was seated, still wearing the ill-fitting British uniform. Dr. Wells was a professional. He began the examination methodically, checking the prisoner's pulse and reflexes. He noted the nervous twitching, the cold sweat. Then he moved to the final part of the inspection, the mouth. He asked Himmler to open it. Wells needed to check for hidden vials, a common practice among captured Nazis. He saw the dark gap in the back of Himmler's lower jaw, a space between his molars. It was the perfect hiding place. Wells instructed Himmler to come closer to the light so he could get a better look. As Himmler moved, he suddenly jerked his head away and bit down hard. A faint, sharp crunching sound, like a nut being cracked, echoed in the silent room. In that split second, Heinrich Himmler made his final move. It was not a grand, defiant gesture, but a furtive, desperate act of self-annihilation. He had listened to the interrogators, understood that there would be no negotiation, no respectful treatment. There would only be a trial, a public stripping of his legacy, and an execution. For a man whose entire identity was built on a foundation of perceived power and authority, this was a fate worse than death. The cyanide was his last vestige of control. As Dr. Wells leaned in, Himmler saw his chance. He bit down, crushing the thin glass vial between his teeth. The sharp, bitter almond taste of potassium cyanide flooded his mouth. It was the poison he had provided to so many others, including his former Führer. Now, it was his own. The effect was almost instantaneous. Dr. Wells immediately realized what had happened and shouted, "He's done it!" He thrust his fingers into Himmler's mouth, trying to sweep out the fragments of glass and the poison. The guards rushed forward, pinning Himmler to the floor. The room exploded into controlled chaos. Soldiers held him down as Dr. Wells and others worked frantically. They turned him on his stomach, trying to force the poison out. They brought a stomach pump, attempting to lavage his system. They administered emetics and stimulants, employing every medical technique they had to keep the man alive. But it was useless. The cyanide was already in his bloodstream, blocking his body's ability to use oxygen. He began to convulse violently, his body arching in agony. His face turned a deep, cyanotic blue. The struggle lasted for approximately 15 minutes. It was a gruesome, undignified end. The man who had orchestrated the calm, systematic murder of millions died a violent, twitching death on the floor of a barren room, surrounded by his enemies. At 15 minutes past 11, on the 23rd of May, 1945, Heinrich Himmler was pronounced dead. For Colonel Murphy and Captain Sylvester, the moment was one of profound frustration. Their ultimate prize had slipped through their fingers. The vast archive of knowledge in Himmler's mind was gone forever. The secrets of the SS, the full inner workings of the final solution, the escape routes of his subordinates, all of it died with him on that floor. All that was left was the grim, bureaucratic task of processing the body of a dead war criminal. They photographed the body extensively, took fingerprints, and made a death mask to serve as irrefutable proof for the world. They documented his few remaining possessions, a pair of spectacles, some letters, and the forged paybook of Heinrich Hitzinger. The man who had amassed unimaginable wealth, plundered from his victims, died with almost nothing to his name. The British authorities faced one final problem: what to do with the body. They could not allow Himmler's final resting place to become a shrine for unrepentant Nazis and future generations of fascists. The decision was made that he would have no grave. 3 days after his suicide, in the dead of night, a small group of British soldiers was given a secret and somber task. They wrapped Himmler's body in a camouflage net, weighted it down with barbed wire, and placed it in an unmarked crate. They drove out into the Lüneburg Heath, a vast, desolate expanse of moorland in northern Germany. They chose a spot at random, a location known only to the few men present. There, under the cover of darkness, they dug a deep, anonymous hole in the German soil. They lowered the body into the earth without ceremony, without a marker, without a prayer. They filled the grave and did their best to erase any sign that the ground had been disturbed. Heinrich Himmler, the man obsessed with ancestry, purity, and legacy, was wiped from the physical landscape of the world. His final resting place remains a secret to this day. While Himmler's suicide was a blow to intelligence gathering, his capture was not without its triumphs. The documents found on him and his accomplices, including papers detailing the structure of Nazi escape networks, provided crucial insights. They offered a glimpse into the so-called rat lines that other high-ranking Nazis would use to flee to South America. The details helped Allied intelligence hunt down other perpetrators, including those on Himmler's own list of 17 SS officers he intended to use as scapegoats. The capture confirmed the effectiveness of the Allied dragnet, even in the chaos of a collapsed nation. It demonstrated that even the most powerful figures of the Third Reich could not escape the consequences of their actions. While Himmler denied the world a trial, his ignominious end served as its own form of verdict. It was the verdict of a coward, a man who could dish out death on an industrial scale but could not face a jury of his peers. The story of Heinrich Himmler's final days is a story of profound irony. The man who meticulously documented the lives and deaths of millions left behind only a secret, unmarked grave. The Reichsführer, who commanded an army of fanatics, died alone, disguised as a man he would have deemed inferior. The architect of a 1,000-year Reich could not even survive 2 weeks beyond its collapse. His death was not the heroic end of a fallen warrior, but the pathetic final act of a bureaucrat of evil. He was a man who, when stripped of his uniform, his titles, and his power, was revealed to be nothing more than a frightened fugitive. His legacy is not one of a master builder, but of a master destroyer, whose empire of death crumbled into ash, leaving behind only the haunting memory of its victims and a final, chilling question about the nature of evil itself. What do you find more chilling? The industrial scale of Himmler's crimes, or the bureaucratic and detached manner in which he viewed them, even to his final moments? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. There are many more tales of World War II waiting to be told.